Hey listeners, we're back for more of a great chat with Dr. Elana Levine, talking about storytelling techniques in soap operas and daytime dramas, because nobody tells a story better than daytime American television in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, even the 2000s. But, you know, one of the ways that they did a great job of storytelling was that they continued to up their technical game. This is TV, after all. And yes, it was derived from, perhaps in many cases, radio stories. But radio is simply two-dimensional compared to what could be done on TV. So today we're talking about the writing and the video montages, some of the things that you remember best about your stories, and then how it is that transitions to longer arcs, like the Passions model, which I have to admit, before I read Dr. Levine's book, it hadn't even occurred to me that Passions had come up with a different way of storytelling. So, Dr. Levine, let's just dig right in. Traumas, dramas, and fantasy. How, in your research, did you come to recognize that there were these different ways that soaps had really undertaken to tell stories?
I started to see the changing shifts in the way that soap storytelling worked by watching a lot of soaps and reading a lot of scripts and reading a lot of conversations between creators and amongst creators and between creators and networks and people like that about what direction they were taking their stories. And I started to see some patterns in the way that things were developing in different time periods. You know, in the early years in the 50s, as television storytelling was coming into being, in part through connection to what television was like at the time, and in part connected to the larger society, the stories were very focused on families, on interpersonal relationships, some of those generational tensions, which would shift into the 60s and 70s to be a little bit more politicized. But those kinds of things were all part of the storytelling, you know, very early on. That was sort of the root of the form. You know, that continues to really be the heart of what soap opera does best, is telling those interpersonal stories. But they took a different cast at different historical moments. And in that period in the 50s, it was really focused on kind of families and the tensions that families were feeling as the society started to shift. And so, you know, As the World Turns began with a story of marital infidelity, basically, where one of the main families of the show, the husband was having an affair. And the woman that he was having the affair with was another character that we knew. She was single, but that she, you know, was involved with this married man. And, you know, that story really launches As the World Turns and demonstrates, I think, some of the tension around the idea of the conventional nuclear family and the gender roles in it. That, of course, in 50s America were, you know, the place to be, the moral center. And yet a show like As the World Turns starts with that being, you know, kind of fractured and disrupted through this extramarital affair.
Were affairs included in the radio drama versions, you know, 8 years prior? And how is it that Erna Phillips and Agnes Nixon and others had to adjust their writing for serial? Because even the primetime shows that were sort of on, whether it was the Betty White show or you know, little Playhouse theater representations, everybody was coming from a different school of writing. But serials to TV were something entirely different, or were they?
Well, there had been those kinds of stories in radio. It's not that they didn't exist, but they kind of take on a new dimension, I think, in TV. Not because they were showing you anymore. There were not sex scenes in soaps in the 50s, which is, I think, everybody thinks, oh, that's soaps are always, no, there weren't really sex scenes before the 70s. And that's a whole, you know, we could have that conversation too.
And we will.
Because I love that topic. It's really fascinating to me. You know, people think about soap operas as being very melodramatic. That's a very common term that we use to talk about them. And yet what I found is that in the 50s, the writers were actually really interested in avoiding being very melodramatic. They really wanted to have realism in their storytelling. And that was in part related to some trends of the day in terms of the way that the kinds of Hollywood movies that were being valued and the kinds of theatrical productions and literature. You know, realism was a very prominent storytelling mode. And the writers of soaps really wanted to be part of that too, and saw what they were doing as very engaged with realism and not with melodrama. And I think what they meant by melodrama was like very dramatic, like, murder plot, international spies and things like that.
And somebody was always in the hospital.
Right. Right. In some ways, this is true across soap history in that most of the scenes are two people sitting in a room talking, and that's kind of no different at any point in soap history, but kind of what they're talking about or kind of the tenor of their conversation is different at different points. And so in the 50s, there's this real effort to really engage with realism and to have some, not that what happens to these characters is so realistic, right? Any soap character is going to face much more trials than the typical person. But the kinds of trials and the ways that they respond to them, writers really wanted them to be real and to be things that real people could connect with. So even if your husband was not having an extramarital affair, you might experience some of the same frustrations with marriage and family life that the characters were facing. And you could relate to their emotional trauma in some way. And so those were the things that writers were striving to get audiences to connect to. And the audiences did connect to as the soaps became, growing more and more popular in TV of the 50s.
Now get your things together and come along back to the hotel with us, Marion. If you don't, it's going to be pretty bad with Mr. Gibson.
I'm not going with you, Dad.
Marion.
And furthermore, I am not going through with the trial.
You don't have any choice about that, Marion. You've retained me as your counsel. I've spent a great deal of time and money on your behalf. You just can't shrug that off now.
Don't let them frighten you, Marion. You needn't go with them. Mr. Gibson can't force you to go.
It isn't only Mr. Gibson, Mrs. Metcalf. Marion knows what I have done for her and her little boy. Now, Marion, I'm your father. How can you do this to me?
Mr. Gibson said that I wouldn't have to go to court.
We'll speak about that further, Marion, but not here and not now. Now, come along, please. We're going back to the hotel where I paid for your room, even though you didn't use it for a long time.
Marion, you don't have to go with them if you don't want to, and I know you don't want to.
Marion, you come.
Marion, don't go with them. Don't let them take you. Marion, scream!
I wouldn't advise that, Mrs. Metcalf. This would make a very interesting newspaper story, wouldn't it?
Marion.
How did video change? And I guess I'll ask this from a perspective of the early video when really technology was still pretty crude, and the amount of money that was in the business to increase storytelling opportunity through video only happened in the 70s and 80s as it became a much more lucrative product line for the networks. How does video evolve?
Yeah. So, the soaps are all live, all shot and broadcast live on TV, starting when they come to TV, some continuing into the early 70s were broadcast live, meaning the actors would be there on the soundstage and they would be running the scenes and sending them out over the airwaves simultaneously as that happened. Now, that was true for all TV at the very beginning in the early 50s, but some primetime TV started to be produced on film, and then, would have to be processed and developed and edited like film does. Videotape didn't really exist in the early 50s. It becomes a viable technology later in the 50s, but doesn't really get used in TV until the 60s in a widespread way. And so the soaps follow along with that. And so that's partly why so many shows were broadcast live. Film is very expensive. The film stock itself is expensive. It has to be developed and edited. Soaps nowhere near had that budget. And so they would be producing these episodes live, and that's partly why many of them no longer exist. You can't see them; they just disappeared into the air. And so the soaps are produced live, and that shapes part of the storytelling. Everything takes place in a studio.
And so, how many cameras would they have had doing those live productions?
That's a good question. I think they probably had three. Three is pretty typical of very early, like the really experimental stuff in the late 40s might have had one or two. But by the time even Search for Tomorrow in 51 starts and As the World Turns a few years later, by the mid 50s, there were three cameras. And so they would be shooting these things live with three cameras and, intercutting in a control room between the different cameras, and having, a few sets that the episode would go between to show things. But the scenes were much longer than what we become used to later on, in part because of the kind of just exigencies of doing live TV, right? Like it was hard to change sets in the middle. They were also running commercials in the middle. So all of those things were challenges that they had to grapple with. And so that's partly the sitting around having conversations was product of the production conditions. When videotape comes along in the 60s and some shows start to be recorded to tape, they were initially recorded what was called live on tape, meaning that they would still run through the episode as if they were doing it live, but it wasn't literally being broadcast in that moment. And that was the production mode for most soaps into the 70s. And, they would, if they had a major screw up, they could stop and redo something. But most of the time they would run through the whole thing pretty much live on tape.
Come in, Delia, away from the door.
I am really not interested in anything that you have to say. I'm going to find Patty.
Patty just as soon step on you as look at you. Yeah, I heard about your magically restored vision, Delia.
I want to know what the hell you heard. Okay? I don't think Patty said anything bad about me.
No, you're right. He wouldn't have once upon a time. But you have just pushed too damn far.
I don't think you know a thing about it.
I know everything, my friend. And don't you forget it. Lying about your blindness is merely your latest deception. You have lied your way through most of your life and gotten away with it. There is no family on this earth that would have put up with so much garbage as the Ryans have with you. I mean, you drove Pat to amphetamine.
Now, wait a minute. That was not my fault. He was working too hard. You were chasing him around neurology and the...
Oh, it was you, damn it! And it's high time somebody said it to your face. You drove Pat to drugs, nobody else. And at the same time, you abandoned your little boy. You saw him, once a month maybe? Oh, the litany of your crimes is so...
Crimes? Crimes? Oh, Faith, you are really crazy. I thought once you got married, you would be contented. No, it's just not good enough for you. I mean, that's crazy. That's really crazy. Faith, maybe you're starting to have another nervous breakdown, huh? If...
Through this period of the live and then the live on tape era, the soaps were never longer than 30 minutes. They were even in the very early days, 15 minutes. Those 30-minute episodes were more, doing that live or live on tape production made sense. The networks start to expand the lengths of soaps in the 70s, going to the hour form that's most typical today. But that was also in part related to technology, because while they had been shot on videotape for a while, they hadn't been doing a whole lot of editing. But electronic video editing becomes a more viable practice by the 70s. And so then you start to have hour-long episodes that are taped in advance and with a little bit more editing than had been the case in the live on tape era.
Wow. Another aspect of storytelling that evolves on top of the video concept is something that hadn't even occurred to me until I read your book. And that in the early days, there was organ music that basically sort of introduced us and lent to a moment that was supposed to be considered dramatic or tense, or that someone was reliving a trauma. And what we now think of when I think of my grandmother watching was that there was organ music to sort of cue that. Help us understand how the overall artistic set of tools could elevate what some of the psychological nuance was that you had referenced earlier about just how it is that they were trying to connect more directly to the audience.
Yeah, I mean, the music example is a good one. And I really love figuring out those parts of the story about how the use of music in soaps changes over time. And, the organ music was very typical of radio, again, and it carried over into the early days of TV. And it's kind of hard because most of those episodes haven't survived, but there's a kind of mix in early TV of whether they're using that organ music or not. Sometimes there were other kinds of, even just switching to a piano from an organ, just the subtle differences in sound there made for a different kind of feeling. And then what starts to happen is they start to use orchestral scoring, where they would have, orchestral music that was recorded obviously in a different time and place, but that would be used and interlaid with the storytelling, which changes the feel. I mean, we're so used to having music is part of our storytelling background that we don't even think about it, but it really shapes the mood and our connection to what we see and hear. And so, those kinds of shifts over time really change the kinds of storytelling and kind of start to shift television soaps away from their associations with radio.
It's fascinating. We're going to jump ahead a little bit to when I guess when I talk to friends about what soaps they watched, when they watched them, what the big memories were, and whether it's a wedding of whoever it was, of a super couple from the 80s or the 90s, or as a loyal Guiding Light watcher Quint and Nola on their fantasy tour of some of the greatest names and titles of literature and movies, and the production value in the 80s was just, and the 90s was phenomenal. Why did soaps take on that sort of larger than life, top the next trend with your storytelling?
Hillary and I are living together, but we're still individuals with individual tastes in things and in people.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, your real understanding about her relationship with Kelly.
Yeah. Well, I'll let you get back to that old movie you were watching when I came in.
Oh, I don't mind missing the middle of it. Besides, the end of Casablanca is the best part anyway.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure. Oh, anyway, I'll be in touch.
Bye, dear.
As far as I'm concerned, you better make up your mind soon and decide which one you're hung up on, Nola. Mr. McCord or Kelly.
You're just saying these things to make me get on the plane. But don't ask me to leave, not like this.
I'm not asking for myself. Inside us, we both know you're a part of Kelly, part of his work. The thing that keeps him going. I know it, you know it. He's got a mission, and it's bigger than anything we ever knew.
It's not bigger than the love that we found here again in this little pocket of the world.
Oh, I think so. You've always loved him.
But what about us? I love you too. And every time I hear Sam playing our song, something happens deep inside, something that doesn't happen with anybody else. I can't walk away from these feelings, not now.
Look, I'm no good at being noble, but it doesn't take much to see that the problems of three little people don't amount to a hill of beans in this crazy world.
Yeah, the fantasy stuff in the 80s is so much fun, and a lot of it was about competition, was about trying to outdo each other and get more attention and draw more of that kind of hype to themselves. But there was also a general sense of an awareness amongst creators that people were really enjoying what was often more lighthearted or had kind of fun or comedic elements in it, and that the audience could get excited about that as well as the more conventional, more dramatic trials and tribulations that characters face. And so that it becomes a big part of the storytelling in that period as well. A lot of it is inspired by the success that General Hospital has at the very beginning of the 80s with the Luke and Laura story, where they send those characters out on the run in the summer of 1980, where they're running away from a mafia guy, and they're trying to, find a secret that's going to expose him. And they go on location and they shoot a lot of scenes on location, which was just looked totally different and seemed so exciting and unusual for soap opera. They have pop music as part of the storytelling. Again, we were talking about music earlier. Orchestral scoring is nothing when you have like pop songs of the day on the soundtrack, which would have been really exciting to young audiences in particular. And then you get literal like fantasy scenarios like the Nola's fantasies that you were talking about on Guiding Light. I mean, those are just so much fun. They're just delightful. And where, she would fantasize about her and Quint, her kind of unrequited love at the time, in these different Hollywood movie plots where she would imagine them in Casablanca or Gone with the Wind or all these different, kind of classic Hollywood movies. And they were just a lot of fun. The costuming, and sometimes they would do them in black and white, and the music and all of those things made those moments, those fantasy moments, really fun for the audience. Those kinds of things had a big impact in drawing a lot of people.
So you made the point that the fantasies were fun. It was a kind of a lighthearted way to get away from some of the heavier storylines that were going on, storylines that have become associated with the melodrama or the drama of daytime dramas. And when we think about, the sort of routine that you have, if you are in the home raising kids or taking care of family members or working from home, whatever it was, or just you taped the soaps and watched them at night. When we think about representation, and we as women think about how it is that we saw ourselves on TV, we perhaps had a certain favorite person who maybe was a woman who was a lot like us, either, ambitious or non-confrontational or, just sort of, you related to all of these different people. They were the ones who were the deepest part of this hour that you spent with them. And then you had these traumas that happened. What did we learn from all that? I mean, life is not exciting. Men who watch sports aren't great athletes necessarily, but they watch these men doing it. So I guess why were we so interested in all these dramas and traumas?
Yeah, I think especially in that period in the 80s and the kind of fantasy period, the pleasure in the soaps was, obviously they were fun and suspenseful and things like that and romantic, but the characters were also kind of fantasy ideals in some ways. So even these characters like Nola or Laura on General Hospital or Felicia on General Hospital, a lot of them were, young and often sort of somewhat naive, but they were also really like spunky and kind of self-assured in lots of ways and very determined, knew what they wanted. And they were really aspirational, not in the conventional ways. It's not like they were necessarily some high-powered lawyer or something like that, although that becomes part of storytelling eventually too. But in that era, these were not like, they didn't fit the conventional markers of success necessarily, but their personalities were very inspiring, I think, because they were not fearful and they were eager to kind of have adventures. And then the other thing was that the men that they were involved with, their romantic partners, kind of loved them for that. And they valued those qualities in them. And they didn't expect them to be conventional wives and mothers. They valued them because they wanted to be on the same kinds of adventures that they were on. And they helped them figure out how to catch the bad guys and those kinds of things. And I think that, today it's not like, we have women superheroes. It seems like a big deal. But I think at the time in the 80s, it was really... it was different than the way we'd usually seen women represented in media culture. They weren't just the girlfriend or the wife at home. They were part of the adventure. Mm-hmm. And that was, it seems like it's small, it's crumbs. And in some ways it was crumbs, but it was really different. And it was a different kind of fantasy for women to have. And I mean, again, we'd seen that before at moments in certain Hollywood films of like Nick and Nora Charles or things like that. It's not like it never existed, but it wasn't a regular part of media culture. And it definitely wasn't a regular part of soap operas until that time.
Absolutely. So I pulled a quote from your book. Frank and Doris Hersley, who were a popular writing team, evidently. Mm-hmm. And they at some point said publicly, "There is no drama in protracted happiness," which I guess is a quote that also could be attributed to the news media, to publishers of newspapers for as long as they've been around. Certain stories sell papers, certain stories drive ratings. And so the idea that you were never going to have your favorite character happy for too long, and that one of 9 different things is going to happen to him or her in the course of the year, sort of made you keep coming back to watch what was going to happen. So I guess in the end it all made sense, but I just always wanted my favorite characters to kind of have a good experience for a while, and maybe not quite so much drama.
Yeah, but it keeps you watching, right? And so I think that audiences get really upset when bad things happen to their favorite characters, but in some ways they keep watching because they want to see them, they want to see them survive. And I still think that that's one of the key secrets to having a really compelling soap character, especially a heroine, a woman, is that she, she suffers, but then she kind of comes back and she retains her strength in some way. And we still look for that. And I think that that's everybody suffers, everybody faces adversity. So characters to a different extent than most of us, thank goodness. But I think that there's something rewarding in seeing them triumph over those adversities, even if it's never for that long.
Yeah, we did see them triumph, and we celebrated that, and we watched so many long-standing characters evolve that they became inspirations to us, whether we knew it or not. Mm-hmm. Oh, Dr. Elana Levine, it's been a pleasure having you talk about these traumas and these dramas and the fantasy, and how it is that back in the early days, technology could only afford so much, and that by the time it all ended, it was over the top. It was spectacular. Listeners, I know what you're thinking. No, there are still a handful of shows on the air. Yes, you're right. the end has not come for soap operas. In episodes 3 and 4, Dr. Levine and I talk more about how the tremendous competition of cable and streaming changed the economics of soaps. And as current viewers may see in their own stories, the budgets are definitely different. And wow, isn't Dr. Levine knowledgeable? It's like we're sitting in on her class. In person, there in Milwaukee, or maybe just via Zoom. Follow her on Twitter at EHL. Clips found in this episode of Advanced TV Herstory are straight from YouTube. Because you know what? Fans of Search for Tomorrow, Ryan's Hope, and The Guiding Light have diligently posted clips that enable us to give you audio examples of some of the points that Dr. Levine made in this interview and also in her book, Her Stories. A big thank you to Catherine Yang for editing and her sound mastery par excellence. That music you hear in our introduction is Jazzer's Take Me Higher, which is found on Free Music Archive. If you haven't lately, check out our vault of past episodes at tvherstory.com. And while you're there, sign up for our e-newsletter. We promise not to share your email address with any other party. Why? Because we like you. Your YI podcast, Low These 5 Years, which in Erica Kane years is about 2 husbands and a 1-month coma. So thanks for listening. I'm your host, Cynthia Bemis Abrams.